Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Tzadi Bet. We're going to mainly cover one topic today with a little bit of other things, but the focus of the daf will be one topic. We just have to finish up the last sugya first, which we're going to really talk about semicha today, and more specifically, other than the very end of the daf, semicha on communal sacrifices. Okay, if you don't know what semicha is, we'll talk about it momentarily. But first we have to just finish up one last thing from what we talked about, the libations discussion. Remember, we've been discussing all along that there were libations, different libations for different animals, and the distinctions are between the sheep, the ram, and the bull. But the sheep and the ram are really the same animal, just difference of ages. And we ended the sugya yesterday with a comparison of all different animals and saying, well, maybe we would distinguish between these animals or these animals and these animals and the ages of different animals and bring different libations, more for the bigger and less for the smaller animal. But the Gemara darshan from all the different parts of one pasuk that no, the only distinction we make is between the rams and the sheep, meaning the male sheep of under age 1 and above age 1, and not anything else. And in fact, Rav Papa ends with this line, starting at the very, very end of Tzadi Aleph Amud Bet. Amar Rav Papa badik lam Rava. Rava would quiz us, quizzed us in class one day. He wanted to check how much we knew. And he said, Niskei Rechela Bekama, how many libations you bring for the Rechela, which is, if you remember, the female sheep in its second year, once it's already 2 years old, or actually beyond 1 year old. Upashtina lami manitin. And I answered him from a Mishnah in Shkalim. And the Mishnah in Shkalim describes, you might remember this, when you went to the temple, what you would do is you would get tokens, you would pay money, and with that, you would have a token. And the token would say whatever it is. And then you would go to the next area where they were giving out the raw materials for the libations. So you bring your token and then get what you were supposed to get. So it says there in the Mishnah, Gedi, if you bought a token that said on it Gedi, which is a kid, which is a baby goat, Mishamesh, that was the name written on the token. It was called the Gedi token. If you had that, what would you get for that? Mishamesh niskei tzon shel gdolim v'shel ktanim shel scharim v'shel nekevot chutz mishel elim. Everything from the sheep family, large and small, male, female, everything was covered by that kid, meaning the smaller amount, other than the ayil. Okay, there's only the one case which the Torah specified where the age matters. Nothing other than that, nothing else matters. Everything goes into what's called the sheep, which is the smallest amount. Now we're going to move on to the next Mishnah. Kol korban, there's basically 3 halachot in this Mishnah. Most of today, as I said, is the first one. The second one we'll deal with at the end of daf, and the third one is going to be in tomorrow's daf. Kol korbanot hatzibur ein behem smicha. Any communal sacrifice doesn't have smicha. What is smicha? Smicha is when the owner of the sacrifice, and you can already figure out why it's not relevant for communal offerings, there is no real owner. The owner of the sacrifice takes his hands and puts them on the animal. Physically puts them on the animal. If you remember, there's a famous machlok at Rambam and Ramban about the purpose of korbanot. And the Rambam basically says, well, that's what people were doing then, so God gave us because that's what was going on. The Moreh Nevuchim, he talks about this, and but it's basically designed in the way that God wanted it to be, right? As the way God wants sacrifices to be different from other nations. But it was basically because that's how people knew how to worship their gods. But the Ramban says, no, there's the reason for korbanot is really that we should be sacrificed because of the sins that we did, and the animal is basically taking our place, okay? And therefore, there's something he talks about the importance of smicha, because he says that's basically you transferring your sins onto the animal. It's like a way of physically kind of saying, it should have been me, and therefore I'm putting my hands on the animal. So at least according to the Ramban, that's the value of smicha, okay? That's how he understands the importance of smicha, which turns it into a very significant part of the korban, although, like I said, that's the Ramban's approach. It's not everyone's approach. So basically, for all communal offerings, there's no smicha, chutz min, other than 2. Which 2 need smicha? Well, 2 that are said explicitly in the Torah. What are they? Chutz min hapar al ba'al kol hamitzvot, which is otherwise known to us as the par helem davar shel tzibur, which is when the community follows an erroneous ruling of the court, where the court is mostly the problem here, and therefore the smicha is done by the zkenim. Okay, and it says so in the pasuk. It says, "V'samchu ziknei ha'idat yidehem al rosh hapar lefnei Hashem." Okay, the zkenim do smicha on the animal, which makes sense. It was their mistake. They issued an erroneous ruling, then the people followed it. So we bring this korban and we do smicha. And the other one is the seir mishtalech. If you remember, we have to go back and understand all of Yom Kippur again. So we'll do a quick summary. There's a bunch of korbanot brought, okay, but the main ones that provide atonement, that are the central ones for the day, there's the Kohen brings his own par, okay, and that atones for the Kohen's sins and for other sins of the kohanim. We're going to talk about exactly which ones. There's a big machloket about it. So that's the bull offering of Aaron. And then there's the two seirim, if you remember, and they do a goral. There's a lottery. Which one's going to Hashem, which means it gets offered. If you remember, both the bull and the seir get offered inside in the heichal. That's all the blood that we mix and then sprinkle it, and all those things we've talked about many times. And then there's the seir that gets sent off a cliff, right? It's called the seir mishtalech or the seir lazalzel, and that basically is what we call the scapegoat, takes upon the sins of the people. Okay, we're going to see exactly who sins, but that scapegoat, which actually isn't a sacrifice at all, because sacrifices get slaughtered in the temple. This doesn't even get slaughtered. Okay, but that needs smicha as well. How do we know? Because it says, "Samach Aharon et shtei yadav al rosh ha'seir hachai v'yitvada alav et kol avonot b'nei Yisrael ve'et kol pesheim l'chol chatotam." Okay, v'natan otam al rosh ha'seir. He basically puts all the sins on the head of this goat by, right, apropos the explanation of the Ramban, right? It's a physical transferring of the sins onto this scapegoat. And that's why it's called the scapegoat, a term that we use all the time. Basically takes upon the sins of the people. So it says in the Torah, Aaron does that. So, okay, seems reasonable. These are the two. But comes Rabbi Shimon. Now, this is Tanakama, which we're going to see in the Gemara as Rabbi Yehuda. We have a very long discussion about this machloka between them. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Af Seir Avodah Zarah. He says, even the Seir Avodah Zarah. What's the Seir Avodah Zarah? And why do we call, I didn't go back to this, why do we call the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur the Par Habal Kol HaMitzvot? Because if you remember, there's two cases of the Helim Tzibur. Helim Tzibur means, right, where the people didn't know because the court ruled erroneously and they did something wrong by accident. They bring a special sin offering. Why do we call it the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur, right, the Par Habal Kol HaMitzvot? Because there's two types. One is the bull, which comes if it's all the mitzvot other than Avodah Zarah. But in Bamidbar, this is all in Vayikra chapter 4. In Bamidbar, there's a separate chapter, right? Horayot was all about this, if you remember, Masechet Horayot. But in Bamidbar, there's a section, if the court erroneously rules about idol worship, and basically says, this isn't idol worship, and then the people do it, and it really was idol worship, so they have to bring not a par, but a seir. Okay, so that seir, according to Rabbi Shimon, is also in the list. Okay, so it sounds like Rabbi Shimon has three. Later we're going to see he only has two, which doesn't make sense, because Rabbi Shimon said even. Even means, in addition to the two you mentioned, there's a third. Okay, but we'll come back to this number 2, 3. We'll get back to it later. So, and that, by the way, is the only one not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. The other two are mentioned explicitly in the Torah. Second part of the Mishnah. Kol korbanot yachid, tunim smicha. Okay, all individual sacrifices require smicha other than chutz min habachor v'maaser v'pesach. Okay, other than the firstborn, the tithed animal, right, the 10th, and Pesach. We'll get to this at the end of Daf, where they get that from. And third halacha, hayoresh. If you inherit your father's korban or your mother's korban, let's say they said, I'm going to bring this korban to the temple, and it's korban ola, and then they die, you then bring it and you do smicha on it. Two other halachot about a yoresh, not connected to smicha. Mevin esachim, you would also have to bring libations for it. And meimar. Meimar is the halacha of tmura, which again is always a confusing one. You are forbidden to replace your animal with another one. If I designate an animal, I can't replace it. But if I do, both are sanctified, both the original and the one I tried to replace it with. Now, if I take, let's say you designated an animal for a korban, and I decide, oh, you know what, I'm going to switch your animal for a different one. That is completely ineffective. I don't, first of all, I didn't do anything wrong because I didn't do anything. And second of all, the animal's not consecrated because I tried to replace your animal with a different one. So I can't do Tamura for your animal. It's an irrelevant action. But if it were for a sacrifice that a parent wanted, that I was the heir of them, then if I did Tamura, it would be effective. First of all, it would be forbidden for me to do it. Remember, it's always, I can't do it. But if I do it, it's effective, and both animals are sanctified. Okay, that's just a halacha about a yoresh, because we got onto that because of smicha. Now we're going to start in the Gemara with a braita. Okay, it's actually a Tosefta. And the Tosefta reads like this: Tanu Rabbanan, Kol korbanot tzibor ein behem smicha, chutz mipar habal kol mitzvot usirei avodah zara divrei Rabbi Shimon. Now already we have a problem, because what does this say? There's only two that need smicha according to Rabbi Shimon. One is the parabal kol mitzvot, and one is the sirei avodah zara. What's missing? Didn't he say even, adding as if there's three? Here it sounds like he only has two. And he drops the sir mishtalech. So we're going to have to figure out why that is. Rabbi Yehuda omer, sirei avodah zara ein behem smicha. So Rabbi Yehuda, right, in the Mishnah we started with Rabbi Yehuda and moved to Rabbi Shimon. In the Tosefta we start with Rabbi Shimon and move to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda's reacting to Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Yehuda's reaction is, there's no smicha for sirei avodah zara, right? Find me the pasuk. There is none. No smicha there. Ve'mi avi tachtehem. Who am I going to replace it with? Okay, this is similar to something we had recently where they were the 7 midot halach, and then he took one out, and then he said, who am I replacing it with? And the Gemara said, why did you need to replace it? And if you remember, the answer was, because there's a tradition that there's 7. We're going to have the exact same thing here. Who am I replacing it with? Sir mishtalech, with the scapegoat. Lo sagya de lo ma'ayil. So now the Gemara stops the Tosefta and says, what? Did you have to have two? Why do you have to put one in its place? Why couldn't you just say there was one? We're going to come back to this line later also, but right now we're going to understand it like this. There's a tradition that there were two communal offerings that had smicha, and therefore if he didn't have those, he had those. So this goes back to what I said before. According to Rabbi Shimon, it sounds like there's two, and Rabbi Yehuda has a different two. And they basically, Rabbi Shimon puts in the seir of avodah zara. Rabbi Yehuda takes out that one, puts in the sir mishtalech. It sounds like Rabbi Shimon doesn't have the sir mishtalech, which is strange because that's not the way our Mishnah sounded, and he only has 2 and not 3. Okay, but that's what seems pretty clear from here, and this is going to be very clear as we move forward. Now we're back to the Tosefta. That was just a break in the Tosefta to say why was this magic number 2, and they said, yeah, there was a magic number 2 here. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon. Okay, often in the Tosefta we've had this where our Mishnah kind of just states the opinions. Tosefta often has a conversation between them. So Rabbi Shimon says, "Hello, now you can't add sir mishtalech to the list. Why not? V'halo ein smicha ele beba'alim. Smicha is only for the owner of that korban. V'zeh Aharon ubanav somchim bo. Who does smicha on the sir mishtalech? Aaron and his sons. Now it's not Aaron and his sons. What he means is the kohanim gadolim. Whatever Kohen Gadol there is that year, the Kohen Gadol does it. Now." And they're not the Baalim. Now we're going to see the root of the debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Now, what you're going to see here is Rabbi Shimon clearly thinks that Aaron does smicha on the sir mishtalech, or the Kohen Gadol, does smicha on it. It says so in the pasuk, he can't deny that. But he doesn't include it in his list of communal offerings that need smicha because he doesn't view this as smicha. Why not? What is smicha? Smicha has to be the owner does smicha. And Aaron and his sons, or any kohanim gadolim, are not the owners of this korban. Why not? Because according to Rabbi Shimon, and we're going to see now the basis of their machloket, the Kohen Gadol does not receive atonement from the sir mishtalech. It's only for Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael excludes the kohanim. And that's going to be the big debate between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Okay? It all is rooted in, do the kohanim gadolim get atonement from the sir mishtalech? This is a whole sugya we learned in Shavuot already. If it sounds a little familiar to you, you might remember it from there. If not, maybe you'll remember it as we learn through it. And if not, it's just good review, right? Because we're not expected to remember everything we learn in Daf Yomi. Amar lo, Rabbi Yehuda said to him, what do you mean? Aaron and his sons receive atonement for the sir mishtalech. It does atone for his sins. Now comes Rabbi Yirmiyah, and he's going to make order for us. I'm a Rabbi Yirmiyah, okay, in case it's not so clear yet, because we haven't unfolded all the information yet. V'az du l'tahamayu. Now they go according to their reasoning in a different sugya. Titanya, as it says in a braita. Now we're going to get to this pasuk. So again, let's just review what happens on Yom Kippur. There's 2 animals whose blood goes inside, and the Kohen Gadol brings the blood even into the Kodesh Kodeshim. That's the one time it goes into the Kodesh Kodeshim with the blood of the par and the seir. And that's the seir that goes to God, right? That's the seir la Hashem as opposed to the seir la Azazel. That's the one that gets slaughtered in the temple. At the end of the section where it talks about the bull and the goat offering that are brought into the Kodesh Kodeshim, it says the following pasuk. I'll read the whole pasuk first, and then we're going to darshan all the words in it. V'chiperet mikdash hakodesh. This is going to atone for the sanctity of the kodesh, and et ol moed, which is the hechal, right, the inner sanctuary. Ve'et hamizbeach, and the altar, yechapel. Okay, it will atone for the altar. Ve'al kohanim ve'al kol am hakahal yechaper, and it will atone for the kohanim and for the whole nation. It will atone again. It says. So now we're going to darshan all those words. V'chiper et mikdash hakodesh zeh lefanai v'lifnim. Now the assumption is, and this is why it came up in Shvuot, because we talked about Yediot Tumah there. If you remember, there were 2 chapters in the beginning of the Masechet. Even though we were talking about vows and oaths, we end up talking about all this other stuff. So Yediot Tumah, because there's Shtayim Shein Arba and Shvuot Shtayim Shein Arba, and we got into this whole thing about Yediot Tumah, which is all sorts of korbanot that are brought for mistakes that happen in the temple, having to do with impurity, where something gets impure by accident. Okay, all sorts of accidents happen in the temple where there's impurity. If you remember, there's different sacrifices that atone in different ways, whether you knew or you didn't know, or you knew you were tamei, you didn't know you were tamei, all different variations. But the point is that on Yom Kippur, the seir that you do and the par, we're going to see what it atones for, but both of them atone for some sort of impurity that happened in the temple. So, Chiperet mikdash hakodesh. What's the kodesh? Zeh lefanai v'lifnim. That's the Kodesh Kodeshim. So if some sort of impurity happened in the Kodesh Kodeshim, this sacrifice will atone for it. Okay, these sacrifices. We're going to see exactly how in a minute. But et ol moed zeh hechal. That's for the sanctuary. Mizbeach kimashmo. If it happened on the altar, that's the altar that's not in the sanctuary but outside, right, in the azara. And yechaper elo azarot. This is if it happened in the whole courtyard area. Kohanim, okay, yeah. So that's the beginning of the pasuk, which is talking about the bull and the goat offering atone for these things. Kohanim, kemashman, okay, Kohanim, it atones for Kohanim. We understand what that means. Al kol am kahal, we know what that is. Elu Yisrael, that's Yisraelim. Yechapel, then there was that extra Yechaper at the very end of the pasuk. Elu halivim, these are the Levites. Okay, so we got there Kohanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. Hu shvu kulam lekaparacha. Why are they all mentioned at the end of the pasuk? Now, even though the pasuk wasn't talking about the seir mishtalech, comes this opinion, which we're going to see in a minute, is Rabbi Yehuda, and he says the end of that pasuk is saying these 3 are all grouped together in some way. What way is that? Shemitchaprim b'seir hamishtalech divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says the end of that pasuk groups together these 3 groups as if they're all one. In what way are they one? Now we're going to learn in a minute that Tumah Mikdash v'Kodashav. Okay, all the accidental tumas that happen, that's what the par and the seir is for. The par is for the Kohen, not only the Kohen Gadol, but for all the kohanim who made mistakes in the temple, and the that's the bull, and the goat that's brought in the temple is for the Yisraelim, for any mistakes that happen with impurity in the temple. Now, why to separate? Well, it makes sense to separate because the kohanim, right, the mikdash is their domain, and maybe their sin is a little different when they make mistakes with tumah, and the other people, again, it's not so clear, but there's logic to say they need a separate track. Okay, so there's one for them and one for them, but the end of the pasuk comes to say, but there's something that they're all the same about. What must that be? This seir mishtalech, and that fits exactly with Rabbi Yehuda, because what does Rabbi Yehuda say? This is the basis for his opinion in our Mishnah. The seir mishtalech atones for the sins of Aaron and his sons as well. So when they do smicha, that's smicha, their own korban. Now it's true, not everyone's doing smicha, but okay, in general, everyone doesn't do smicha. When you have a communal korban, you can't possibly have the whole nation. Just like in the parlin davar shel tzibur, you have the skanim do it for the people. Here you have the Kohen do it for the people, and he's an owner, and that's why it's smicha, and that's why it's on the list. According to Rabbi Shimon, now he doesn't disagree. He says, of course, Aaron does smicha, but he says that's not the smicha we're discussing here. Smicha we're discussing here is smicha by the owner. And he thinks that seir mishtalech is not a korban of the Kohen, because he's going to disagree with what we just saw. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kashem Shadam Hasil Naasa Bifnim Mechaper al Yisrael Val Tumat Mikdash V'Kodashav. Kach Dam Apar Mechaper al Kohanim Al Tumat Mikdash V'Kodashav. Now he says, just like, he's going to do a comparison game. Just like in Tumat Mikdash V'Kodashav, we have two tracks. We have the Kohen track, which is the bull, and we have the Yisrael track, which is the goat. Kach Dam Hapar Mechaper, Kashem shevidui si'ira meshalach mechaper al Yisrael b'sha'ar averot. So now he starts off and he says, well, just like we split between them when it comes to Tumat Mikdash and or any kind of impurity that happened in the temple, we also split between them when it comes to atonement for all their sins. So he's going to say, what atones of the si'ira meshalach? There's no blood there, right? They throw it off the cliff. It's the vidui. If you remember in our davening, right, kachaya omel, right, the Kohen would say, and he would do the vidui, ana Hashem chatati pashati, right, the whole thing, and he says, or chatu v'pashu am Yisrael. So the vidui there's a vidui that goes on the si'ira mishtaleach. That vidui goes for the Jews' sins, but not the kohanim's, and that's the one where he does semicha, and that doesn't go for the kohanim. He's not the owner, and that's why it's not on the list. But just like there's a vidui for the si'ira mishalech, which atones for Yisrael b'sha'ar ve'rot and all their other sins, kach vidui shel par mechaper al kohanim b'sha'ar ve'rot. He says the par splits into two. There's the blood of the par, and there's the confession on the par. The confession on the par is not for mistakes that happened in the temple. The confession on the par is for all the sins of all the kohanim. So they have there's two tracks. Okay, now why? It's a really good question, right? Why do the kohanim need their own track? When it comes to Tumat Mikdash V'Kodashav, like Rabbi Yehuda says, I can get that there's a reason for a difference. Temple is the Kohen's area, their domain. Maybe there's a separate track and a different korban that they need. Again, why exactly? It's a good question, but you could see that. When it comes to all the sins, it's strange to distinguish between the kohanim, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda doesn't distinguish. He thinks the si'ira mishalech is for everybody. But it requires more thought to think about what exactly Rabbi Shimon's opinion is based on. Why he assumes that there's separate tracks, but he does believe there's separate tracks for their sins as well. And that is the basis for him not including this in the list of two. Now, he does think there's semicha, but he doesn't really include this in his list of two. He says there's two, but it's not the same two that Rabbi Yehuda thinks. One is the same. Everyone agrees, the parlin davar shel tzibur. But he puts in, right, there's a difference. It's interesting that it's both a goat. One thinks it's the goat, the scapegoat. That's Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Shimon thinks it's the Sirei Avodas Zarah, which we're going to get to later, how he gets to Sirei Avodas Zarah. Okay, it's the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur, parallel, but for idol worship. So now we're going to have a question on Rabbi Shimon, based on our last drasha. If you remember, what was the theory of Rabbi Yehuda? Well, it says at the end, Kohen, Levi, Yisrael is referenced at the end of that pasuk. Seems they're all the same, meaning they bring the same, right? The Sirah Mishalech covers all of them. So Rabbi Shimon, Havadai Hushvu, clear there was this comparison. What do you do with that? In Hushvu, Dibnei Kaparandinu, he agrees they all get atonement for all their sins on Yom Kippur, but Miu Kol Chavacham, Chaper B'Dinafshe, but each one has its own track. Okay, this one in this way, that one in that way. So they're the same, that they all get atonement, but not in the same manner. Now comes a very strange section of the Gemara, and the commentaries say this is a Sforaitic text, which means it was added later, after the Moraitic time period was finished. Some people wrote notes in the text and comments and explanations, and sometimes they get incorporated into the Gemara. We've talked about this before. This seems to be a clear Sforaitic text because it's not really adding so much more. It's just sort of organizing. It does sound a lot like somebody's notes, okay? Because you're going to say, what's this really adding? We kind of learned all this already. So don't be bothered by that because it's really just an explanation of things we already know. So now they're going to say the following. The first thing they do is they're now going to kind of summarize. Rabbi Yehuda, Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav, Yisrael mechapre b'dam ha'se'ir nasa b'fnim, v'kohanim b'par shel Aaron. So again, we're just summarizing. According to Rabbi Yehuda, now we didn't actually see this written inside. I did mention this before, but it didn't say it inside, and that's why this is important, I guess, to add, which is, he agrees that in Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav there's different tracks. He doesn't disagree with Rabbi Shimon about that. Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav, Yisrael get it with the dam ha'se'ir, the blood of the se'ir, and the kohanim with the power of Aaron. The power of Aaron covers Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav. Doesn't cover all the other sins. How are all the other sins? B'shar ve'erot, ela ve'ela mechapre b'vidoi siyar mishtalech. Rest of the sins, right? It's the scapegoat for everybody. Ula Rabbi Shimon, b'shar ve'erot, nami kohanim b'vidoi depar mitkapre. And according to Rabbi Shimon, all the other sins, right, the kohanim have the vidoi of the par. Okay, the vidoi of the par, the confession, right, again, the par splits into two. The blood is for Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav, any kind of impurity mistakes that happen in the temple. And the rest of them are covered by the confession on that same bull. Kidikatani. Now, if that wasn't enough to summarize, they're now saying, and this is actually what you see in a Mishnah in Shavuot. Okay, as it says in Shavuot, Echad Yisrael ve'echad Kohanim ve'echad Kohen Mashiach. It's actually, I think it's a Mishnah in Shavuot. Yeah, I believe so. I don't see a reference here on the side, but I'm pretty sure it's a Mishnah in Shavuot. Anyway, it says, Echad Yisrael, echad Kohanim ve'echad Kohen Mashiach. Okay, both Yisrael, the Kohanim, the Kohen Mashiach, the Kohen Gadol. Okay, they all get atonement. Uma being Yisrael l'kohanim u'lekohen Mashiach. Again, this is all going to be repetition. It's just seeing the same thing in a different source, which again is strange. Although it's not like there's really a point to bringing this. It's just organizing it. What's the difference between Yisrael and Kohanim and Kohen Mashiach? Ela shedam hapar mechaper l'kohanim al tumat mikdash v'kodashav zo divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the only difference between them is in tumat mikdash v'kodashav. That the dam hapar instead of the seir is going to atone for the tumat mikdash for the Kohanim. For Rabbi Shimon Omer, and he's going to say the exact same thing here that we quoted him saying before, Kashem shadam asir nasa b'fnim mechaper Yisrael, kach dam hapar mechaper l'kohanim. And, right, just like the blood of the seir is for that, the blood of the par is for, right, them for Israel, this for the Israelites, that for the Kohanim, for mistakes that happen in the temple with impurity. And kashem sheviduyo shel seir mishalech mechaper al Yisrael, same thing, just like the vidui of the seir mishalech is for the Israelim. Kach viduyo shel par mechaper al kohanim. So the confession of the bull atones for the kohanim. Okay, that was just another way of saying it. They're just showing this source says the same thing. Okay, again, it's not really clear why they're bringing this, but that's why if you say it's a Sephardic text, it makes a little more sense. It's not like the Gemara really meant to bring it, but somehow someone was just kind of summarizing it on the side, and then it ended up getting incorporated into the Gemara. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. So that was topic one. Topic one was this machloket, and particularly within this machloket, the issue of why the Siyar Mishtalech is a point of contention. Now we're going to move to the Siyar Avodah Zarah, because if Rabbi Shimon takes out the Siyar Mishtalech, he has instead of it, he says the Siyar Avodah Zarah. Okay, we could look at it the opposite. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't have the Siyar Avodah Zarah, he puts in the Siyar Mishtalech. Either which way. Now we want to focus on the Siyar Avodah Zarah, which again is the parallel to the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur, just the par is on all mitzvot, and the Siyar is brought specifically if it's idol worship, where again, the court issued an erroneous ruling, and the majority of the people followed it and did what the court said. Tanu Rabbanan. So it's all going to start from this pasuk. V'samchu ziknei ha'edat yidehem al rosh hapar. So this kohanim do smicha on the head of the bull. This is the communal bull offering for all the mitzvot. Par ta'un. Now it says hapal, right, or rosh hapar. Why does it go back to the par? We know it's the par. It already said it was the par before. So they could have just said samchu ziknei ha'edat yidehem al harosh or something like that on the head. Why does it say the head of the bull? To tell you. Par ta'un smicha, only this one needs smicha, the bull, but not ein sirei avodah zarah tunim smicha. But in the parallel case of this year for avodah zarah, there's no smicha. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Now here I think Rabbi Yehuda is a little less understandable. Right? Why would you distinguish? Right? The only reason to distinguish is because the Torah doesn't say so. The Torah says there, it doesn't say it there. On the other hand, you would say they're kind of one and the same, right? One is for avodah zarah, one is for idol worship. If you need smicha there, you need smicha there, and that's really Rabbi Shimon's position. Rabbi Shimon Omer, par ta'un smicha b'zkinim, ve'ein seirei avodah zarah tunim smicha b'zkinim ela ba'aharon. Okay, he says something very strange, and in a minute we're going to say this bright makes no sense, and we're going to have to change it. So I'm not going to spend too much time explaining it, but I'll explain the words, which is, Rabbi Shimon says, well, the seir avodah, what's the par coming to say? The par needs smicha, but the seir doesn't need smicha by the elders, but does need smicha by Aharon. Okay, that's what he seems to be saying here. So Gemara says makes absolutely no sense. Uriminu. This completely contradicts some other drasha. Now we're going to go back to the pasuk of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. And it says there, Samach Aaron et shtei yadav al rosh ha'seir hachai. on the seir that's alive. What does it mean, the one that's alive, as opposed to the one that's being slaughtered and the blood's going in the temple, right? There's two, one to God. That's not that one. Which one does he do smicha on? The seir lazalzel, or seir mishtalech, the one that's going to get sent off the cliff. Now they darshan this word hachai. Hachai ta'un smicha ve'ein sirei avodah zarah tu'unim smicha divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So what does it say? Which kind of seir needs smicha? Just the one that stays alive. Obviously, it doesn't eventually get thrown off the cliff and dead, but not that gets slaughtered. Basically, it's alive, okay, at that stage, and it will be alive and won't be sacrificed in the temple. But not a seir, a different seir, not the one that's going to be slaughtered in the temple, okay, which is the seir for Avodah Zarah. That's Rabbi Yehuda, which fits perfectly with his approach. Rabbi Shimon Omer, I'm going to darshan this differently. You're right that Hachai is coming to say this is different from the Seir Avodah Zarah, but in what way is it different? Chai ta'un smicha ba'aharon. This is the only korban that the Kohen Gadol does smicha. I'm turning now to Amud Bet. Ve'ein Seirei Avodah Zarah tu'unim smicha ba'aharon ela bizkenim. But the Seir Avodah Zarah doesn't need smicha by Aaron, but it does need smicha by the elders. Now this is the complete opposite of what he said in the previous Braita. What did Rabbi Shimon say? It doesn't have smicha by the elders, it does have by Aaron. And this says, it doesn't have by Aaron, it has by the elders. So complete contradiction. On Rav Sheshet, to resolve the contradiction, he says, he starts with a question. Do you think that first Braita is accurate? It's a complete messed up Braita, okay? Which makes sense. People pass them on orally and sometimes recited them incorrectly. He says, it's obviously a mistake, what says in that Braita, that they have the wrong version, because it makes no sense. Why would Aharon do smicha on the seir for Avodah Zarah? What's Rabbi Shimon? What did he say earlier? The whole premise of why the seir mishtalech doesn't get smicha. Again, just to remember, it does physically get smicha. Aaron puts his hands on it, but it's not the smicha that we're talking about. It's the same action, but it's not in the list of what's smicha, because smicha is the baalim, the owner. Right? Hamar Rabbi Shimon, smicha bebaalim binan. You need smicha for the owner. They actually all agree with that. Right? Which is Rabbi Yehuda thinks the seir mishtalech Aaron is the owner. He thinks he's not. But Rabbi Shimon clearly states that smicha is only the owner, and the Kohen has absolutely nothing to do with this mistaken ruling of the court that then the people follow. That's not the Kohen. That's the court's domain. So, therefore, there's no way that he would think that Seir Avodah Zarah, the smicha is done by the Kohen. Makes absolutely no sense. So therefore, Ella, either Taretz Hachi, some people say Hachi Katani, this is how it should read in the Braita, and he's basically going to completely reread the Braita. Okay, the first part is the same. Hapar, parta'un smicha ve'en Seirei Avodah Zarah tu'unim smicha divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda stays the same, that's not a problem. But now, I want to go back for a minute. I'm going to read you the Braita, because you're going to see the way they reread it is completely, almost no words are the same. Okay? So, it said here in the original Braita, at the bottom of Tzadi Bet, Rabbi Shimon Omer, par ta'un smicha bizkenim, right? The par needs smicha by the elders. Ve'ein Seirei Avodah Zarah tu'unim smicha bizkenim ela ba'aron. And the par and the Seir Avodah Zarah, though, doesn't need smicha by the elders, but by Aaron. Doesn't make any mention of this drasha of Hachai, which we darshaned in the second Braita. But basically, they're going to put that drasha into here. Okay, they're going to say, this is how you read it. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Hachai. It's really, he's darshaning not the par pasuk, he's darshaning the one about the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Chai ta'un smicha ba'aron, ve'ein Seirei Avodah Zarah tu'unim smicha ba'aron, ela bizkenim. And they're basically rereading this first Braita to read like the second Braita, which is, he does say something, but what he's trying to say is, the Seir Avodah Zarah is different from something, but it's not different from the par. It's exactly the same as the par, Helen Dever Shel Zibur, because it's the same kind of korban. It's different from the smicha that's done by Aaron and Yom Kippur. Smicha done by Aaron and Yom Kippur is the Kohen Gadol. That's the only case the Kohen Gadol does smicha, and, right, but the Seir Avodah Zarah, the smicha is not done by Aaron, it's done by the elders. Now, why would he bother bringing that in? So now the Gemara gives us an explanation of what's going on here in this Braita. V'hachi ka'amar le Rabbi Shimon le Rabbi Yehuda. This is what he's telling Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon's telling Rabbi Yehuda. Seirei Avodah Zarah ba'u smicha. The first point he wants to make is the Seir Avodah Zarah needs smicha also. Okay, because that's his point where he disagrees with Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda. So he says to Rabbi Yehuda like this: V'ish shmi'alach delo bai smicha. Now, if you heard by some tradition somewhere, you have this idea in your head that there's no smicha for the Seir Avodah Zarah, I'm going to tell you where your mistake is. Be'aron hu deshmi alach. What you remember is, and that's why it starts with the negative, right? There is no semicha for Siyur Avodah Zarah by the Kohen, but there is by the elders. Because what he wants to say is, if you had you think in your head, you remember learning somewhere that there's no semicha by the Siyur Avodah Zarah, I'll tell you what you learned, or even though it's not what you learned, but I'll tell you what's really the truth. There's no semicha by the Paralim Dever, by the Siyur Avodah Zarah, by Aaron, because of that drasha of Hachai. Only the live seir gets smicha by Aaron. But there's a different seir, the Siyur Avodah Zarah, that gets smicha. It's just not by Aaron, it's by the elders. And that's what he's saying. Umiuta me'achayhu. And that mi'ut that you're thinking about, where it limits something about the Siyur Avodah Zarah, is specifically that Aaron doesn't do it. And it's from that word hachai, where it comes up in the Yom Kippur service. So it kind of, he wants to put him on the right track and say, yeah, you're remembering something, but you're remembering it wrong, and it should be different. Now, obviously, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree with him, but that's why he brings in that whole thing. And that's the way we fix the other Braita. Now it doesn't contradict the one we saw, and it doesn't contradict what we've been learning. Okay, now we're going to have a bit of a question on Rabbi Yehuda, which is, Rabbi Yehuda, lama li lama'atinu mikra? Why does Rabbi Yehuda need a pasuk to say? Okay, what do we start with in this section? The Braita said, hapal. Pal and not Siyur Avodah Zarah. He doesn't need a drasha for that. Why not? Because what do we learn? Ha Amar Ravina Gemira Ishtei Smichot B'Tzibur. Ravina taught us that there's a tradition. There's 2 smichot for communal offerings. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's very obvious which the 2 are. The 2 mentioned in the Torah. Samach Samchu Yedehem Al Rosh HaPar, the Paralim Dever Shel Tzibur, and V'Samach Aaron Yadav on the Siyur Lazazel. And because he thinks that's totally smicha, because Aaron is the Baalim. He holds that this atones for Aaron's sins as well. So you have your 2 examples. So he doesn't need any more. You don't need a drasha to say, and not the Siyur Avodah Zarah. It's obvious. If there's only 2, then it's clear. To which the Gemara answers, Girsa Ba'alma. Now, we have 2 things here. One is a pasuk, and one is a tradition, right? And the Gemara is very flippant right now about one of them. And just, it's just we don't know exactly how to translate this word, a girsa. I mean, a girsa is a text. But what they mean is, it's just is a mnemonic device kind of thing. Okay, like saying asmachta ba'alma. So now, so I see you're writing scriptural allusion, but it's not exactly. And that's why I'm being very vague about how I'm defining this. Because now we're going to explain this in 2 ways. Some people say this is a scriptural allusion. Okay? With allusion, with an A. That it's just what we call, usually, asmachta ba'alma. Okay, Rashi in the Ketav Yad has 2 interpretations. The first is, it's the pasuk. It's just, we say this all the time. It's an asmachta ba'alma. It's a mnemonic to remember. Really, there's a tradition, which means really, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't need any more than that. Why does he add the pasuk? It's just to remember from the, to have some sort of reference in the pasukim to remember things. But Rashi in the Ketav Yad suggests, and that's why it's a little bit strange, because when I was learning this, I said, why doesn't it say asmachta ba'alma? That's usually the term they use. So the second interpretation in Rashi is the opposite, which is the pasuk is the main source, and the Gemire, what we said is a tradition, and I mentioned this earlier when we taught Ravina in the first place, in the beginning of the sugya. Right now we're going to understand it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, or some sort of old tradition. But according to the second option, they're being flippant about that one. It's not really. It's just once we learned it from the pasuk, then Ravina gave it this term, there's 2 smichot, and that's how you'll remember it. Okay, he put a number to it. But that wasn't really like an old tradition. It was actually after we got it from the pasuk, they made up they stated this is a tradition. Okay, so it's interesting in terms of, why is this different language used as opposed to the typical asmachta ba'alma, which it should be, right? So anyway, it's 2 different ways of reading it. So either which way, one is really not as significant. We don't know which one. Rabbi Shimon. Now we're going to move to Rabbi Shimon, and we're going to say, where does he really get this, though? That the Sirei Avodah Zarah. Okay, so we understand he doesn't have, right? He doesn't have Siyur Mashalach, but how does he know to put in the Siyur Avodah Zarah? So they say, Nafgalami Detanya, comes from the following Braita. V'samach yado rosh hasir. Now this is the pasuk about the nasi. If you remember in that section, we spent a lot of time on this on Horayot. In the section about the different chataot that there are, One was for a nasi who sins, and it says there, samach yado al rosh hasir. There's an individual, so that's why it's not on our list. Individual brings, and he does smicha on it, on the seir, on the head of the seir. Now, it could have just said, samach yado al rosh. Again, why is the word seir here? Lirabot, it's to include that there's another seir that needs smicha. What is that? Seir nachshon the smicha. Okay, not what you were expecting. Why? Because this is Rabbi Yehuda, different Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said there's another individual who brings another nasi. What's that? When the Nasi'im brought their korbanot to the temple, right? They each did smicha on it, remember? So they each bring a seir izim l'chatat. They brought a seir izim sin offering and prasha naso. And that needed smicha as well. Okay, that has nothing to do with our topic because it's an individual offering and it was also a one-time in history. Rabbi Shimon omer, l'rabot sirei avodah zarah l'smicha. Okay, everyone thinks it includes some other seir. It's just Rabbi Shimon thinks it includes our seir, the seir avodah zarah. And then they add this line, which the Gemara in a minute is going to say, why do you add this line? Shayach Rabbi Shimon omer, because he would say, he was known to say, kol chatat shenichnas dama lifnim tu'una smicha. Anytime the blood is brought in the inner altar, it needs smicha. Okay, because again, remember the par and the seir, their blood is brought on the inner altar, right? That makes them, they're different than most korbanot, with the blood is brought on the outer altar. Okay. Lama li l'meimer shahaya, why would he say that? Simana ba'alma. Again, we're back to, it's just a mnemonic. It's just to remember which seir. Oh, it's the seir that's brought inside, which is the seir for avodah zarah, which is also like the paralin davar shel tzibur. Now, the problem here is going to be, there's another one that's brought inside. What's that? The seir on Yom Kippur, which, right, remember, the seir lazazel gets smicha, but not the seir that goes inside the blood on the altar. So, ve'ema seir nasa b'fnim. If already the whole thing of Rabbi Shimon is, well, the blood is brought inside, we do smicha, why didn't he add then the seir la Hashem on Yom Kippur? Jumia desir nasi de mechaper al averot mitzvah yidua. Since the whole thing is darshan with a pasuk about the nasi, it has to be something that's similar to the seir of the nasi. Now, when does the nasi bring a korban chatat? When the nasi sins about something, the nasi knows he did a sin. Let's say he ate chalev, for example, okay, thinking it was shuman and he ate it by accident. So he knows what he did wrong. If you remember, what's the seir atone for? Back to the beginning of our shir. The seir that's brought inside atones for accidental impurity that happened in the temple that we don't even know about. It's just to kind of cover us and give us atonement for things that we don't even know happened. So that's not the same as the seir of the nasi, whereas the seir of avodah zarah is, we know we sinned in this way. We did it by mistake, but we know we sinned. So they're both mitzvah yidua, and that's why that's the one included and not the other. Now they're going to ask the same question they asked before on Rabbi Yehuda. V'Ravina damar gemirish tes smicha b'tzibur krai lamali. When you need the psukim, if you know there's two, then you know that seir lazazel he can't add to his list, so he must add this one, seir avodah zarah. So they say itzrich hilchadav itzrich krai. No, you need the halacha, the tradition, and you need the psukim. For what reason? Well, de'imi kra, if you just had the pasuk, havamina zivchei shalmei tzibur. Maybe it's zivchei shalmei tzibur. Maybe it's the shnei kivsei atzeret. Now, if you knew there were two, well, there could be some other one you could add. What's that? The two sheep that you bring on Shavuot. Why would you think that needs smicha? Just like Kikusham, it needs to pirka de kolam menachot. It's always funny when the Gemara references itself. It says, right, just like we saw in the parak of kolam menachot, there was a question. What was the question? They're going to remind us. Amar Rabbi Shimon shlosha minim tuna shalosh mitzvot. If you remember, he said there's 3 korbanot with 3 parameters. There's the shlamim of an individual. There's the shlamim of the tzibur, which is this one we're talking about, the kivsei atzeret on Shavuot. And there's the asha mitzorah. And they each need 3 things, 2 out of 3. Remember, there's tnufa when it's alive, tnufa of the parts that are going to be put on the altar, right? The imurim and the chazev shok when after the slaughtering, and smicha. But if you remember, right, the shnei kivsei atzeret doesn't need smicha because it's communal offering. We just said all communal offerings don't, other than the ones on our list. This wasn't on our list. But now you could have questioned it. Say later b'kav chomer. You could have questioned it by a kav chomer. This is the question they asked before. Why don't you say zivchei shalmei tzibur tunim smicha mikav chomer? What's the kav chomer? Ma shalmei yachid she'ein tunim tnufa chayim tunim smicha chayim. The shlamim of an individual, you don't do the waving when it's alive, and yet here you do the waving when it's alive, right? And those need smicha when it's alive. So what do you say? Since ours do need shnufa when it's alive, maybe it should also need smicha when it's alive. And then you would think that's shnei kivsei atzeret. And that's why it's tzrich. That's why you need the halacha to say it's not 3, it's just 2. Don't add this one to the list. If you had said it was or the tradition, What was the problem? Well, what we saw before. Lo yadinan, hey ninu. You wouldn't know which one. What does the pasuk teach us? It's from the seir and a sea. Has to be similar to the seir and a sea, and that's why it's the seir of the Avodah Zarah and not the seir from Yom Kippur. Because again, we're going to read it inside. Kamash malan dumi the seir and a sea d'mechaper alavevot mitzvah yidua, because it atones for a mitzvah that's a known sin, not something that, well, it's just going to cover in case something happened and I don't even know what happened. Okay, and that's why we need the pasuk, and that's why we need the tradition. Traditions say 2 and no more, not this other case, the Shnei Kivsei Atzeret. And 2, well, which 2? This seer, not that seer. Okay, because it has to be like, we draw from the pasuk, like the seer of the Nasi. Okay, we're now going to end with Kol Korbanot Yachid Tunim Smicha Chutz Mi Bechor Maaser Pesach. So we finished that whole first part of the Mishnah. We're now on the second part, which is the individual. All need smicha other than these 3. Why not these 3? So we're going to bring a bright that says we're going to darshan it from 3 psukim of Shlamim, where the word korbanot appears. I don't have time right now, so you can look at them inside. But the section in chapter 3 of Vayikra has a mention of the word korbanot actually 6 times. The commentaries disagree about which ones we're talking about, but theoretically you could say Vav Zayin Chet, 3 psukim in a row, which end with smicha, all have the word korbanot. If you want to look inside, you can see. Tanu Rabbanan, korbanot. So each word korbanot, his korban, and we're going to say not some other korban. Okay, v'lo habachor. Now, each time we're going to have to say, why do we need a drasha? She'achov alodini. You might have said it's logical. Shlamim she'en kedushatam mirechem tunim smicha. Shlamim are less sanctified than bechor, because shlamim, you're taking a random animal and making it sanctified, as opposed to the bechor, which was born already sanctified. So bechor she'kedushatam mirechem ein odin tunim smicha. Wouldn't we think then if shlamim needs smicha? Of course, the bechor needs smicha. Talmud Lamar korbanot v'lo bechor. That's why it says korbanot and not the bechor. Korbanot v'lo maaser, shechov alodinu. What would have been the logic to say yes maaser? Mashlamim she'em makdishim lefnehem u'lacharehem tunim smicha. The one before, the one after doesn't become sanctified. We'll talk in a minute what this means. And yet it needs smicha. So maaser shemekadesh lefanav ha'acharav ein odin sh'te'un smicha. Remember, we just learned this about 9, 10, and 11. If the 9th one you called 10, and then the 10th you called 9, and then the 11th by accident you called 10 because you just said 9. So you would end up, all 3 are sanctified. That's what it means, the one before and the one after. There is no before and after in Shlamim. But the point is, this one Maaser Behema can actually cause sanctification for 3 animals. So wouldn't you think that all the more so we need smicha? Talmud Lomar, that's why it says korbanot and not Maaser. Korbanot v'lo Pesach, she'achov alodinu. Again, you would say maybe it would be Pesach. It's not an obligation. You don't have to bring the Shlamim. That's always voluntary. V'hacha, right, but Pesach, right, and Havei, in any way needs smicha. Pesach, Shuba, Amo, Vave, you have to bring the Korban Pesach. Ein Odim, wouldn't you think it's more stringent? Shet, Ta'un, Smicha, Talmud Lamar, Korbanot, V'lo, Pesach. Okay, now we're going to end with a question. Ika l'mifrach. Wait, you can knock down all this logic and say, what do you mean? All this logic is irrelevant because there's unique laws by Shlamim that don't exist in these other korbanot. They need libations, right? Which those 3 don't have libations. We saw that just recently. And the chazav shok go to the Kohen. We don't have any of that by the other korbanot. So why would you have thought to say they need smicha? Actually, these drashot are irrelevant. And we end with kras machtaba alma. Well, the psukim are just ways to remember. 3 times it says korban. It precludes it limits not these 3. That's how you remember those 3 are on the outs. It's just a mnemonic. Okay, and it's not really, it's learned from there because you don't really need a drasha. It's pretty obvious that this is something unique to Shlamim, just like Shlamim has other things, and not these korbanot. Okay, so with that, we finish today's stuff. It's a little more to finish up here that's basically in tomorrow's stuff, but we'll finish that up and then move on to the Yoresh, to the heir. Okay, what we did mainly was we basically discussed the machloket, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, which are the 2 that need smicha, all based on this machloket about the Sir L'Azazel, and then on these different drashot about which one is excluded, is the Sir of Avodah Zarah included, is excluded from a particular pasuk, right? Each one had their pasuk. We have, why did they each need their pasuk? And then we explained, and we ended with, how do we know that Bechor, Maaser, and Pesach are on the outs, drasha, but then we said, the drasha is really just a mnemonic. It's kind of, because it doesn't say they need it, and there's no reason to think they need it. We wouldn't necessarily learn from Shlamim to there, because they're completely different. And with that, we finish today's stuff. Wishing everyone a good day, and may the quiet continue. For those who it's not quiet, may it remain quiet.